Thanks very much. I'm actually a bit warm. Somebody brought me a shirt over. It's actually a very, maybe it's me, but wearing the same shirt I wore yesterday is just a horrible experience. So it's really nice to, I'm very grateful for the kindness of the person who gave me this lovely shirt. Whether I shall ever wear it again is another matter, of course. But in my third talk, I want to sort of summarize what I've said so far and then offer some thoughts on the way forward. We do live at a time of what many people call culture war, and while I do think that there is a war going on, I also think that the language of war is sometimes not the most helpful. I spend most of my days teaching 18 to 22-year-olds, and my game there is to persuade them. Most of my students are good Christian kids, but they live in a very different world to the one that I grew up in. And I have to provide them with things that are persuasive. They want to agree, I think, with me by and large, but they do not respond to the very aggressive kind of language that is now the stock in trade of much of what goes on in the culture war. So what I want to talk about today is ways that we can think perhaps more holistically about addressing the kind of problems that I've identified. A way perhaps of being more persuasive than we might otherwise be. At the core of what I said in the first two lectures is the notion that we imagine ourselves today to be independent, free-floating. We tend to think of ourselves as sovereign over who we are. Of course, the story is a little bit more difficult than that. Hopefully, as has become evident in what I said in the first two lectures, that there is a sense in which who we are is always shaped by the environment in which we find ourselves. The difference, though, between today and, say, 300, 400, 500 years ago is that the environment in which we now find ourselves is a much more volatile and unstable one than it was before. And much of that is connected to technology. One thing, though, that I did not mention in my second lecture and that is important relative to understanding how we feel and what it means to be an individual human being is the way technology is constantly changing. One inference from what I said in the second lecture is this, that if we are shaped by the technology that we use, if that is decisive over how we think about what it means to be individuals, about how we imagine the world in which we find ourselves, then when that technology is changing, who we are is changing too. Think about that. As technology changes, so we are changed by it as well. My area of scholarly expertise is 16th and 17th century. I'm really a Reformation historian by background. And the Reformation, one could make the case that the Reformation is the result of a technological revolution. The invention of the printing press really transforms Europe. I don't think the printing press makes the Reformation as we had it inevitable, but I do think the Reformation makes the printing press makes something inevitable. You cannot continue to have a kind of society that assumes illiteracy, that ties power to land, that ties the economy to agrarianism once you have the printing press. Once you have rising literacy rates, you will find that trade and things like that become much easier to pursue. Power shifts. Power shifts away from land, shifts towards those who can read and write, shifts towards those who have adapted to the new technology. The disturbing thing about the Reformation is this. One single technological invention leads to 150/200 years of bloody religious conflict in Europe until Europe sort of stabilizes around the kind of transformations that the printing press has left in its wake. When you move to today, we have inventions of the magnitude of the printing press arriving with disturbing regularity, such that we do not have time to assimilate the impact of the last one before the next one crashes like a wave on the shore. If Europe in the 16th and 17th century was a continent not at ease with itself, a continent racked by angst and by conflict, then how much more so the modern world where technology is sweeping in wave after wave after wave, and we are not able to assimilate to one before the next one arrives. And again, that enhances, exacerbates, makes very dark in some ways this notion of human beings as free floating selves. We have nothing to hold on to in order to know who we are. It does not surprise me that my students, many of them, struggle with anxiety. I'm told that at Grove City College, 40% of students during their time at college will have some sort of contact with the college counseling service, either for themselves or on behalf of a friend. And I'm told that that's actually not a bad proportion these days in higher education. It's certainly not untypical. Why is that? I think it's because they live in a world that appears to be constantly in flux. Knowing who you are is critical to being confident. Think about the notion of friendship. I will return to this in a little while. But think about the notion of friendship. When I was at school, I had 7 or 8 friends, good friends. And I knew who they were. I saw them on a daily basis. Falling out was costly. I joked about this last Saturday. I gave a lecture on friendship at Providence College. And I made the comment about the number of friends I had at high school. And I said, falling out with friends was costly, but we had a way of fixing it. When you fell out, we had this thing called fighting. Went to an all-boys school, and you'd fall out. There would be a punch-up. And like 30 minutes later, it would all be done, and you'd be back as friends again. There were distinct social pressures in a small group of real friends who actually knew each other and hung around together that kept the lid on falling out. Falling out was a costly thing. Friends are also the people who made you feel that you had worth. There's a thing that I deal with it a little bit in the book that Hegel calls recognition. You are who you are, Hegel says, to the extent that another self-consciousness acknowledges you. What does Hegel mean by that? It means you are who you are to the extent that other people treat you as a person of value. When you think about it, it's important that other people treat us as people of value. That's easy to do when they're real physical presences in your life. If you live online, then people can very cheaply and easily take swipes at you. I don't do Twitter. Every now and then somebody will send a tweet to me about me that isn't very flattering. I don't do Twitter. I don't care about Twitter. I decided some years ago, writing on the stuff I do, if I care about Twitter, man, I need to look for another career. But if somebody sends me a tweet about me where I'm being bashed, that hurts for about 10 seconds, and I don't care. If you live on social media, then it must be devastating. It must be devastating. Again, technology serving to destabilize us, to make that free-floating liquid self very, very vulnerable. I would say we also, and this before I come to sort of think about my responses, we live now at a time where we have lost our sense of the transcendent. What do I mean by that? Well, the example I use to try to impress on people how a sense of the transcendent can make a difference between how you think about yourself and your age and your behavior. Cologne Cathedral I don't know how many of you have ever been to Germany, but if you change, I remember once traveling from Utrecht in Holland to go to a conference in Germany, and I got the train. And at some point, I changed trains in Cologne, and I had a couple of hours to spare. And Cologne Cathedral is just over the road from the railway station. So I popped into Cologne Cathedral, and it really is one of the most spectacular feats of the human mind. It is maybe the greatest, certainly one of the greatest Gothic cathedrals in medieval Europe. It has an interesting history. They started building it in 1248. They suspend building for a couple of hundred years in the middle of the 16th century. And they restart sometime later and complete it in 1880. In 1880. That's over 600 years to build Cologne Cathedral. Now, it takes 200 years longer than it should have done because of the Reformation. Nobody could have anticipated that. But what we know for sure is that the person who first thought up Cologne Cathedral, that the man who carved the first stone, that the men who laid the first foundation stone, knew that they would never worship in that building. It wasn't going to take 25 years to build. They knew that this was a building that was going to take hundreds and hundreds of years. What's interesting is they still did it. They thought it was worthwhile. Fascinating. If I were to say to you, hey, I got this great project. I'm going to build, it's going to be one of the most magnificent cathedrals in the world. I'm looking for investors to help me get the project off the ground. And you say to me, well, when can I expect some return for my investment? And I say, about the year 2700, something like that. You're not going to give me any money for that. Might even be difficult for me to hire people to help me start the project. Why? Because we don't think long term. Those men who started building that cathedral in the 13th century, many of them, I think, we could say this about them, they had a magnificent view of God. They had a magnificent view of the transcendent. And therefore, they knew that it wasn't all about them. And what they were doing was something great for future generations. That's what made it worth doing. I think we have lost that sense of the transcendent today. We have lost our sense that the world is bigger than us and that what we do is important for future generations. That brings me then to the series of things I'm going to suggest as how we might think about a response to some of the problems that I've outlined this morning. And the first one is this. I think we have to abandon short-termism. I think it was about 2 years ago, after the book had come out and I was starting to go around and give these talks and meet with people. And I have to say that I had no idea when I wrote the book that the trans issue would be such a big one. Almost everywhere I've spoken, not yet here today, thankfully, but almost everywhere I've spoken, somebody has come up to me and said, the trans issue has hit our family. I did not anticipate the cultural triumph of the trans issue so rapidly. But about 2 years ago, when it became very clear to me how deep-seated and how massive the problem was, I remember commenting to my wife that I'd come to the conclusion that I was going to lose every single cultural argument that I would ever make for the rest of my life. I'm in my mid-50s. Maybe if the Lord is good to me, I have another 20 years, 25 years, maybe of my brain still firing on enough cylinders for me to be able to engage in these kind of arguments. Maybe, I don't know. But I came to the conclusion that in the next 30, 40 years, we're not going to see much of a turnaround on many of these issues. And strangely, that was liberating. And it was liberating on the grounds that I don't have to do it all. I just have to be faithful in the case I make and in the things that I say and do. One of the great scenes to me of in the Lord of the Rings movies, in fact, the line is not in the book. It's one of those lines in the movies that would actually have been great in the book. I think it's in The Return of the King, when Theoden is mounting his horse and he's going into war. He's going into battle, and one of his retainers says to him, "You know you're going to die, and you know we're going to lose." And Theoden says, "Yes, but I will meet the enemy on the field of battle nonetheless." I think the first thing we need to do is realize we're probably going to lose the big issues of our day, but we should meet the enemy on the field of battle nonetheless. Because if we do not do so, then the battle is already decided at this point. I had the privilege of working for a year as a research fellow at Princeton University, 2017 to 2018, and Professor Robert George ran the program that I was on. And one of the things that I learned from Robbie was this: never cede the field of battle. Every Tuesday, all the fellows would get together for coffee, and Robbie would come in, and some new craziness had happened at Princeton or in the wider culture, and he'd say, "You'll never guess what they're trying to do now." And he would tell us, and then he would say, "So what are we going to do about it?" My instincts in those days was, well, I need to write another lamentation about what's going on in our world. And Robbie said, "Well, that's okay, but we need to do more than that. We need to think about building for the future." So the first thing I want to say is this: we need to think long term. Remember Cologne Cathedral. Cologne Cathedral was worth building, even though none of the men who started the project lived to see it completed. I'm grateful they considered it to be worth doing. Secondly, I think we need to have an attitude in the church that responds to our times correctly. It seems to me that it is inevitable that the church in the United States is going to be more marginal in the coming decades. That's inevitable, it seems to me, at this point. I think it's also unfortunate. I am not one of those who celebrates the death of civic Christianity. I think I get the point when people say, well, now we'll know who the true Christians are. I think I get what they're getting at there. That, yeah, there have been a lot of hangers-on in the church over the years when Christianity is comfortable. When it becomes a bit uncomfortable, the hangers-on disappear. I understand that. I understand that, we're not to despair. On the other hand, a society where there's an awful lot of hangers-on in the church will tend to be a society where you can take your children for a walk down the high street during the month of June without being confronted by homosexual pornography in shop windows. So I don't rejoice in the death of Christendom on that front. I think Christendom was a safer place for kids, to be honest. So I'm not one of those who rejoices in our marginalization. Having said that, I don't think that lamentation is a fully adequate response. It is right to lament what is going on. It is right to lament. But if all we do is lament, we miss the great opportunities that our times are providing. Marginalization is uncomfortable, but it's also a great opportunity. Marginal communities tend to be strong communities. Some of you will be familiar with Max Weber's great thesis on the spirit of capitalism and the spirit of Protestantism. And he makes a case there that Protestantism brings a particular way of viewing the world that is particularly conducive to the development of capitalism. And I think that his thesis has much to commend it. But I also think it is not a fully adequate account of, say, the rise of powerful capitalism in the 19th century. If you were to look at England in the 19th century, some of the big powerhouses in English capitalism, at the heart of the Industrial Revolution, are marginal communities. I think what's distinctive about the Quakers, for example, in the 19th century Midlands in England, is not their Protestantism so much as the fact that they're marginal. If you're a nonconformist, really, in England, up through the 19th century, if you're not an Anglican, there's pretty much not much you can do. You can't go to Oxford or Cambridge, the two big universities. You can't be a civil servant. You can't teach. There's all kinds of stuff you can't do. So what can you do? You can make stuff. You can make stuff. You can become a powerhouse in trade. Cadbury's. Some of you are familiar with Cadbury's chocolate. Cadbury's, Quakers. Cadbury's are Quakers. Think about the Jews in medieval Europe. There's nobody more marginal in medieval Europe than the Jews. And yet they become a powerful community, a powerful economic force. Think about the LGBTQ movement. Think about how marginal that was in American culture, even 60 years ago. Now, it might be an exaggeration to say it basically sets the political agenda, but it certainly is a very, very significant player in the setting of the political and cultural agenda in the United States. Why? Well, read Rosaria Butterfield's book, Secret Confessions of an Unlikely Convert. And her description of the LGBT community there is interesting. It's a real community. Strong community that becomes a powerful community. If we simply regard our marginalization as an opportunity for self-pity and lamentation, we miss an opportunity. Community. Community. Those who are on the margins tend to band together. And again, it would take another set of lectures covering the same material but from a different angle. One way you could recast what I've said today is this. Human beings want to belong, and the world no longer gives them places to belong. The way I teach the humanities course in Grove is I start by saying, human beings have two desires, basically. We desire to be free. We intuitively live our lives as free. We make decisions. Nobody likes, it's why prison is such a harsh punishment. Nobody likes being confined. We like to be free. But we can't just be free. We have to belong too. We have to have somebody acknowledging us as somebody of value. It's not good for man to be alone. The only bad thing in creation before the fall was Adam's on his own. There's nobody like him who can acknowledge him as somebody of value. And that's why it's so beautiful the way Milton describes Adam seeing Eve for the first time, and he goes on to say, nothing else in the world was ever the same again. Once I saw her, the whole world was transformed. Why was the whole world transformed? Because Adam himself was transformed. Once he's in relationship with another one of his kind. So one of the answers, I think, that we need to think about at church is this. What does strong community look like? Church has an opportunity here, being handed to us on a plate because we're being pushed to the margins, of being a strong community where people have each other's backs and look after each other. That's important in the way it shapes how people think. One of the reasons my wife and I open our home so regularly at Grove for students to come over is we want them to enjoy hospitality. We want them to enjoy something of community. I want them to say, hey, we've been married 33 years, nearly 33 years. And it was the best decision either of us ever made. We want them to realize that the cult of the free-floating self, where you keep your options open forever, and you never tie yourself down to anybody else, that's the law of diminishing returns, humanly speaking. Have you noticed that these magazines who interview swingers and people living these wild lifestyles never interview 80-year-old swingers? Have you noticed that? They're never there. Why? Because if they still exist, they're old, broken, and alone. Nobody thought Hugh Hefner was cool in the last year of his life. He looked incredibly cool in the 50s and 60s, I'm sure. He looked like a pathetic old man in the last year of his life. Community. We need to think about marginalization as an opportunity for community. We need to reinstate, and this was the burden of my lecture at Providence last week, we need to reinstate the concept of friendship. Talking to, I think it was a Young Life worker. Some of you may be familiar with Young Life. They're a Christian group that often work in the public schools. They had a huge and very, very beneficial and positive impact on my oldest son when he was at the local high school. I was chatting to a Young Life worker last 12, 18 months, 2 years, and I was asking him what it was like in the school where he was working, and he said, among the 12 to 13-year-old girls, he said 80% of them identify as lesbian. I thought, wow, that's a huge percentage. And I said, why do you think that is? And his answer was very interesting and very insightful. His answer was this: they don't know what friendship is. And our society does not teach them what friendship is. All we give our young people is sexual categories. It is not unusual for young teenagers to have strong feelings for people of the same sex. It isn't. We used to call it friendship. We used to have this thing, the best friend, when I was at school. The pal who was the same sex as you that you were really close to. The best friend. If you take the category of friendship away, or you devalue it to the point where it virtually means nothing, you give young people no category for understanding their feelings other than a sexual one. We need to reinstate the concept of friendship. The whole notion of the free-floating self sort of militates against friendship, of course, because one of the things about friendship is, what makes friendship beautiful is somebody gives themselves to you without necessarily getting much from you. I said last week, I used the example, you know that phrase, a face only a mother could love. And you use that, what do you mean the person's ugly? But the point you're making, of course, is you're ugly, but your mother loves you. But that doesn't count for very much, because your mother's kind of obliged to love you. So, oh yeah, my mother's meant to love me. That's not great that she thinks I'm good looking. Wow. It's when somebody who's not obliged to think you're good looking thinks you're good looking, that's what boosts your ego a bit. That's what makes friendship so wonderful. Family are one thing, but friendship's quite another. Why is friendship so beautiful? Because it really does involve somebody else acknowledging you as somebody of value. Not for what they can get out of you, but merely because you are you and they enjoy being in your company. That's powerful. And I think on that level, marriage is the greatest form of friendship. The greatest form of friendship. We need to reinstate the concept of friendship then. How do we do that? By modeling it. I don't think we lost the wars we lost because we lost the arguments. I think O'Donovan is right. The other side often don't have very good arguments. We can easily demonstrate the problems in the arguments of the other side. What we lost was the way of life, the form of life. We need our churches to be places where friendships are on display in beautiful ways to young people and beyond. We need to reinstate the importance of the body. I think the disembodiment about which I talked in the last lecture and of which Mary Harrington spoke in that quotation I gave, disembodiment is endemic in the way we live today. I was commenting to somebody just before lunch. I said, even now, if I get an Uber rather than a taxi, I don't have to speak to the Uber driver at all. I can do it all on computer. No money even has to change hands. I don't even have to hand him a credit card. It can all be done online. It might as well be a zombie or a robot who's driving me. There is no human interaction at all. We are a very disembodied world now. Very disembodied world. We need to reinstate the importance of embodiment. I think the weakness of Protestantism was exposed during lockdowns. I suspect Texas is a little bit like Western Pennsylvania. People will say to me, how do you cope with the lockdown? It's kind of what lockdown? You know, you did it probably because your governor's sane. We did it because it's Western Pennsylvania and the governor's a long, long way away. Western Pennsylvania is sort of upper Appalachia. Everybody does their own thing. I hear about, they're going to reduce the driving age in Pennsylvania possibly from 16 to 15. I'm pretty sure I see 12-year-olds driving tractors around the farms on the road every day of the week. What disturbed me, I think, about the ease with which so many Protestant churches went online was not the decision to go online. We could debate the merits of that. What disturbed me was that so few people thought that anything of real value had been lost, that the transition was so easy. It may have been necessary, but we should at least have found it very difficult and deeply regrettable. A lot of people didn't. And I'm not talking about because of government interference or anything like that. It's just that they didn't get that actually being with people in church is critical. And Protestantism, I think, is peculiarly vulnerable to that because we think God's grace is mediated by the preaching of the word. And we sort of think that we can get that through watching a TV screen. Actually, when you're watching worship on a TV screen, you're a spectator, not a participant. And that's a big difference. You may have picked that up when your kids were young, perhaps, and maybe like I did, you bought a sort of video camera, and you would video them at school events. I gave that up after 2 or 3 months because I realized that while I was videoing their events for posterity, I was not enjoying their events as they happened. I was never really there when I was looking at them through a screen. Protestantism has problems with the body, I think. Problems with the body, and yet bodies are critically important. How do we know that we are not independent, free-floating selves? Because we're bodies. Why is my granddaughter still, even now, dependent upon her parents? Because she's a tiny body, incapable even of changing her own diaper, let alone foraging for food and feeding herself, or building herself shelter. It's the fact that she is a body that makes her dependent. And as you get older, you may become more independent, but guess what? Typically, your parents, they're getting older and they start to become more dependent on you. So you then become a creature that is obliged to other creatures. Why is that a face that only a mother can love? Because mum is obliged to love that face. She's obliged to care for her child. I'm at that tipping point now, mid-50s. The annual medical just isn't quite as straightforward as it was 10 years ago. Nothing to worry about yet. But every year it's kind of a bit more of a relief when I get through. We're okay. Remember, my wife's going to criticize me for this, but glucose numbers came back one year and I got a big thumbs up. And I get a text from my wife saying my glucose is up or something. We need to fix our diets. And I text her back with what is this we of which you speak, So the interesting thing was my numbers were higher than her, but I was given a thumbs up. Get a bit more complicated because I'm a body. I'm a body. And think about how this plays out morally. I think a lot of the moral debates we have today, particularly on the life issue, play out the way they do because we're trading in abstractions. Peter Singer, I teach a class on Peter Singer each year at Grove, a one-off class, and we look at his philosophy of abortion and infanticide. And I quote a Peter Singer interview, because when Singer believes that if you have dementia, you're no longer a person, and therefore you can be euthanized and it isn't murder. You're not a person until you're 2 years old, so in theory you should be able to euthanize a child up until they're 2 years old. He says he wouldn't argue publicly for more than 21 days because the public will never buy more than 21 days. But certainly up until you're 2, you're not self-conscious enough to be a person. Singer is interviewed about his mother. His mother had Alzheimer's disease and he and his sister helped care for her. And the interviewer asks him, is that inconsistent with your philosophy? And his comment is, yes, but I guess it's more difficult when it's your mother. Of course it's more difficult when it's your mother. She nursed you, she carried you in the womb, she nursed you at her breast. She told you that she loved your face even when nobody else did. Your mother's not an abstraction, she's a person. with a profound bodily connection to you. I've often thought in class, got the students to think of a scenario where Robert George, pro-life thinker, and Peter Singer, pro-euthanasia, pro-abortion thinker, both professors at Princeton, are walking down Nassau Street late one night, and they hear a baby crying, and they walk over to a shop window, and there in the shop door is a little crib with an obviously newborn baby crying in the crib. And I always ask the students, do you think they're going to argue about what to do about that baby? Of course they're not. It's not that Robbie's going to say, wow, it's a newborn baby, we need to get her to hospital ASAP, and we need to find the mother and get the mother some help, because clearly this is a difficult and distressed situation. And Peter Singer says, no, it's not a person until 2 years old. We can leave it here to die of exposure or be eaten by the feral cats and the dogs. No, there'll be no disagreement. They'll both want to get that baby to the hospital. Why? Because it's not an abstraction. It's a person. It's a body. I think we need to reinstate the importance of bodies and persons in Protestant thought. If there's anybody there, any young person there thinking about what they might do for doctoral studies, I would say, don't do what I did. Too many Reformation people out there. We're 10 a penny. Do ethics. Thankfully, the Catholic Church has produced an awful lot of good ethical teaching, which, because there is enough of an overlap between ourselves and the Catholics, Protestants are able to sort of use in very helpful ways. Two thinkers who perhaps shaped me more than anybody else in the last 2 years are Carter Sneed and Erika Bakayoko, both excellent Catholic thinkers, the one from an ethical, the other from a legal perspective. Praise God for the contributions that they make. But Protestants need to be making contributions as well. If you're a young person, think about doing ethics. Think about doing your research in ethics, because we need more great Protestant ethics. The church needs to teach the whole counsel of God. Remember, coming up to 2015, I don't know what the debates were in the PCA, but one or two of my OPC friends, I'm in the OPC, I like to think the PCA is not far from the kingdom of God. The OPC, we're right there. Couldn't resist that. When I was pastoring briefly in the OPC, and my church rose to more than 100 people attending in worship on a Sunday, my PCA friends would pull my leg and say, so which doctrine are you soft pedaling on? You know, where are you compromising to have got so many people into your church on a Sunday? I can't even remember why I brought that up now. But anyway, no, I do. It was in the run-up to Obergefell v. Hodges. A number of people that I chatted to in the OPC are saying, do we need to add a paragraph to the Westminster Confession dealing with gay marriage? To which the answer actually is no. Because the Westminster Confession is very clear in its positive teaching on what marriage is. And therefore, although I don't think a single one of the Westminster men in the 17th century would ever have imagined a day where there would be such a thing as gay marriage, it is naturally excluded. Because what's taught there is positive teaching rooted in the whole counsel of God. I think as churches, we don't need to panic necessarily about what's coming around the next corner. We can never predict that. 15 years ago, no one could have predicted the transgender thing would be crashing on the shore. What we can do is teach the whole counsel of God. And if we do that, it provides people with a framework to handle anything that comes their way. If you have a good doctrine of creation, then transgenderism can be handled in that context of a good doctrine of creation. We're just revising the humanities core at Grove City College, and I'm on the committee looking at the capstone. And my colleagues and I have taken the view that what we need is a capstone course that teaches students how to think ethically from a Christian perspective. Not that tries to second guess what craziness is coming up next and dealing with that, but let's teach our students good, basic Christian principles about how to think and live ethically that will be useful whatever comes round the corner. The church needs to teach the whole counsel of God. The church needs to be in the game of catechizing its people. The church needs, I think, to help people reinstate that transcendent frame that the men who built Cologne Cathedral had. What does that mean? It means that we need to have a worship that really does raise our minds heavenward. We need to have a worship that really does allow us to speak with Paul in terms of this light momentary affliction compared to the eternal weight of glory that is to come. Now, I'm not a traditional versus contemporary worship sort of guy. I'm very happy to concede there's a lot of culture in how we think about worship, and it's often not a one-size-fits-all. What works in Western Pennsylvania may not work in Houston. But I think the basic questions we need to be asking about worship are the same everywhere. How do we, in the context in which we find ourselves, communicate that the God we worship is a transcendent God, and the context in which we operate is an eternal context? As I say, the specific answers may look different in the same way that, what is appropriate for a formal meal in Britain may look different to a formal meal in the United States, may look different to the dress for a formal meal in sub-Saharan Africa. But that question of how should I be appropriately dressed to show respect to other people is the same in each of those three contexts. I think that's the same with the church. We need to think about how worship, gathered worship, helps to shape our imaginations. Worship isn't just about what we learn from the pulpit. The whole thing has to be a form of life that shapes the way we intuitively think about ourselves and our place within the world. We need to be aware of the impact of things like technology. My guess is that some of the questions that have come in will be, okay, so how do I handle technology relative to what's going on? To which my answers will likely be, I don't know. I just don't know. But I would say this, being aware enough to ask that question at least starts you down the road towards a solution at some point. Unless you're aware of the problem, by definition, you cannot start thinking about a solution to the problem. We are embedded in a technological world. And I'm not a Luddite. I think technology brings a lot of good things. I do not want to live in a world before anesthetics or antibiotics. I used to joke that when I was teaching Reformation that if any of you in the class find it too easy to fall asleep at night, just download from early English books online one of those 16th century surgical manuals, and you will never sleep again. You will never sleep again. Technology has delivered a lot of good. Every society, from the beginning of time, has been technological to some level. We are to be technological people because the creation mandate is to subdue, to transform the world in some way through technology. But we face tremendous technological power at this point that we need to reflect upon. And I think we need, finally, to return to think about what does it mean to be a church as a community. Again, one of the temptations of something like Twitter is it tempts us to think that we can have influence over people we do not know, and to fritter away our time trying to influence these people we do not know, over whom we can never have any influence, while neglecting the people we will rub shoulders with day to day, over whom we can have tremendous influence for good or for ill. I write a lot online, various magazines and things, but I'm under no illusions that the people I have most impact on are the students who sit in my classes, who come around to my house to sit on the deck when we open the house for hospitality or whatever. Those are the people I have influence on. Those are the people that I'm helping to build for the future. So my final point is this. Let us be strong communities. I think Roger Scruton's right. We live in a time where we need to build local things that will last. We need to build local things that will last. That's not defeatism. constantly been told by certain sectors of the Christian world that I'm a defeatist because I think the national scene is basically lost and we need to rebuild locally. My argument is, unless we rebuild locally, the national scene will never be changed. I'm simply saying that, hey, this is how you go about transforming the national picture by producing, developing, creating strong families and strong communities in the places where you are put. So my final point is we need to return to community. And if we return to community, then in some ways we address that problem that I first identified as being a principal issue in the issues we face at this particular point in time. And that is the collapse of external identity markers. If we can have strong communities, then we can provide people who want to belong and who want to know who they are with places where that can be done. Thank you very much for listening so patiently.